The mahogany conference table felt cold under my trembling hands as attorney Patricia Caldwell adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and cleared her throat. Around me sat my stepmother, Vivian, my half-sister Madison, and my younger brother Kyle, all fidgeting with barely contained anticipation. The silence in the downtown Atlanta law office was suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of an antique grandfather clock in the corner. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Thank you all for coming, Caldwell began, her voice professionally neutral as she opened a thick manila folder. We're here today to review the last will and testament of William Henry Morrison, who passed peacefully last month at the age of 73. My stomach twisted. Dad. Even now, 3 weeks after his funeral, hearing his full name spoken aloud felt like a fresh wound. William Henry Morrison, the man who had built Morrison Construction from a one-truck operation into the largest commercial building company in Georgia. The man who had taught me to read blueprints before I could properly tie my shoes. The man who, according to what I was about to hear, apparently thought I deserved nothing from the empire we had built together. I'll begin with the primary beneficiaries, Caldwell continued, and I watched Vivian lean forward eagerly, her perfectly manicured fingers clasped together. My stepmother had married my father when I was 12, bringing her daughter Madison into our lives and transforming our close-knit father-daughter relationship into something far more complicated. To my beloved wife Vivian Morrison, I leave our family home on Peachtree Hills Avenue, valued at approximately $2.3 million along with all furnishings, artwork, and personal effects contained therein. Vivian's face broke into a satisfied smile, and she reached over to squeeze Madison's hand. My heart sank, but I tried to maintain composure. The house where I had spent my teenage years, where Dad and I had spent countless evenings reviewing construction contracts and discussing business strategy, would now belong entirely to the woman who had never shown genuine interest in either of us beyond what we could provide. To my stepdaughter Madison Blackwell, I leave my investment portfolio, currently valued at approximately $1.8 million including stocks, bonds, and retirement accounts, to be managed by the designated trust until her 25th birthday. Madison, now 22, practically bounced in her chair. She had always been the princess of the family, pursuing a degree in art history while living rent-free in a downtown loft that Dad paid for. To my son Kyle Morrison, I leave Morrison Construction Company, including all assets, contracts, equipment, and business operations, along with the operating capital of $3.2 million currently held in company accounts. Kyle straightened up, his eyes wide with surprise. At 24, he had worked sporadically for the company, showing up when he needed money but never demonstrating the dedication or business acumen the company required. I felt the blood drain from my face. Morrison Construction. The company I had literally helped build from the ground up, the company where I had worked every summer since I was 14, starting as a file clerk and working my way up to project manager. The company where I had spent the last 8 years as Dad's right hand, overseeing major commercial projects worth tens of millions of dollars. Caldwell paused, glancing at me with what might have been sympathy before continuing. And finally, to my daughter Elena Morrison, I leave my collection of vintage construction equipment, currently housed in the warehouse on Industrial Boulevard, along with my personal library and the contents of my home office. The room fell silent, except for that damned clock. Construction equipment, a library. I had dedicated my entire adult life to building something meaningful alongside my father, and he had left me what amounted to scraps, old bulldozers and books. That concludes the primary distribution of assets, Caldwell announced, closing the folder with a decisive snap. Are there any immediate questions? My stepmother and Madison were already whispering excitedly about redecorating plans. Kyle looked stunned but pleased, probably calculating how much money he could extract from the business before running it into the ground, and I sat there, 29 years old, feeling like the ground had opened up beneath. Elena, Vivian said, turning to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, I hope you understand that your father made these decisions with everyone's best interests at heart. You've always been so capable and independent. You'll be fine. capable and the same words I had heard throughout my childhood whenever I was expected to handle disappointment or unfairness with grace. When Madison got the bigger bedroom because she needed more space for her art supply. When Kyle was excused from family obligations because he was still finding himself. When I was expected to work twice as hard for half the recognition because I was naturally responsible. I had built my identity around being the reliable daughter, the one who never complained, the one who could always be counted on to handle whatever challenges arose. But sitting in that conference room, I realized that my reliability had been taken for granted to the point where my father had felt comfortable leaving me nothing substantial, assuming I would simply accept it and move on. I need to understand something, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Dad and I worked together every day for the past 8 years. I managed the Richardson Center project that brought in $12 million last year. I negotiated the Henderson municipal contract that's worth $15 million over 3 years. How exactly does that translate to inheriting used machinery? Caldwell shifted uncomfortably. Your father's instructions were very specific about his reasoning. He felt that Kyle needed the structure and responsibility of running the company, while you had already proven your ability to succeed independently. Succeed independently? I couldn't help the bitter laugh that escaped. I've been working 60-hour weeks to build Morrison Construction into what it is today. I've sacrificed relationships, personal time, and my own potential business ventures because I believed I was building something with my father, not just for my half-brother who shows up when he needs spending money. Kyle finally spoke up, his voice defensive. Look, Elena, nobody's saying you didn't work hard, but Dad obviously thought I could handle running the company. Maybe you should see this as an opportunity to do your own thing. My own thing, as if the company I had poured my heart and soul into was just a stepping stone rather than my life's work. As if 8 years of 18-hour days, missed vacations, and sacrificed opportunities meant nothing compared to Kyle's genetic relationship to our father. I stood up slowly, gathering my purse and jacket. The room felt smaller with each passing second, the walls closing in as the reality of my situation crystallized. I had been completely written off by the man I had idolized, reduced to an afterthought in the distribution of an empire I had helped create. Thank you, Miss Caldwell, I said, extending my hand to the attorney. I assume there are documents I need to sign regarding the equipment and book. Actually, she said, standing as well, there are some additional details about your inheritance that we should discuss privately. Could you stay for a few minutes after the others leave? Something in her tone made me pause. There was an undercurrent I couldn't identify, almost as if she was trying to communicate something without saying it directly. I nodded, settling back into my chair as my family gathered their things. Vivian paused beside me, placing a perfectly manicured hand on my shoulder. Elena, honey, I hope you know how much your father loved you. These decisions weren't about love, they were about what he thought was best for everyone. I looked up at her, this woman who had never worked a day in her life but would now live in luxury from my father's success. I'm sure they were, Vivian. Enjoy the house. After they left, the conference room felt both emptier and somehow more spacious. Caldwell walked to the window, gazing out at the Atlanta skyline before turning back to me with an expression I couldn't read. Elena, she said, her professional demeanor shifting slightly. There are some things about your father's estate planning that weren't appropriate to discuss in front of the other beneficiaries. Things that changed the entire picture of what you've actually inherited. My heart began to race. What kind of things? She returned to her seat, pulling out a different folder, this one thicker and marked with red tabs. Your father was a very intelligent man, and he understood the legal and financial complexities of business ownership in ways that most people don't. What your family heard today was only part of the story. I leaned forward, every nerve in my body suddenly alert. What do you mean? Caldwell opened the new folder, revealing documents I had never seen before. Corporate filings, property deeds, bank account statements, all bearing signatures and dates going back years. Elena, over the past 8 years, your father has been systematically transferring ownership of virtually everything of real value directly to you, through a series of legal maneuvers that were invisible to everyone else in the family. The words hit me like a physical blow. What? Morrison Construction, the real estate holdings, the investment accounts that actually matter, the intellectual property rights, the equipment leases that generate passive income. It's all yours. It has been for years. What Kyle inherited today was essentially a corporate shell with a fancy name and enough operating capital to keep him busy for a while. I stared at the documents she was spreading across the table, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Property deeds, with my name. Corporate ownership documents, showing me as the sole proprietor of holding companies I had never heard of. Bank accounts with balances that made the numbers from the will reading look like pocket change. This is impossible, I whispered. I would have known. I would have had to sign things. Caldwell smiled for the first time since I had met her. Elena, you've been signing documents as a corporate officer and project manager for years. Your father embedded these ownership transfers into routine business paperwork. You've been unknowingly accepting ownership of your inheritance in small pieces every time you signed off on a major project or approved a corporate restructuring. The room started to spin slightly as the implications hit me. So when Kyle thinks he's inheriting Morrison Construction, he's inheriting a subsidiary company that owns the name, some equipment, and enough cash to operate for about 2 years if managed well. The real assets, the properties, the major contracts, the relationships with suppliers and clients, that all belongs to holding companies that you own completely. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I thought about Kyle's smug expression as he had calculated his windfall, about Madison's excitement over an investment portfolio that was apparently less significant than it had seemed, about Vivian's satisfaction with a house that, while beautiful, was a fraction of what I had apparently inherited without knowing it. Why? I asked, my voice barely audible. Why would he do it this way? Caldwell's expression softened. Your father left a letter for you, to be given only after I explained the legal situation. But based on our conversations over the years, I believe he wanted to see how your family would react when they thought they were getting everything and you were getting nothing. He wanted to know who would stand by you, and who would reveal their true character when they thought there was nothing left for them to gain from you. The genius of it was breathtaking and heartbreaking at the same time. My father had orchestrated an elaborate test, one that my stepmother and siblings had failed spectacularly, while simultaneously ensuring that his life's work remained in the hands of the person who had actually built it alongside him. I was not the forgotten daughter who had been left with scraps. I was the secret heiress who already owned everything that mattered, surrounded by people who had just shown me exactly how little my relationship with them meant when they thought I had nothing left to offer. The question now was what I was going to do with this knowledge, and how long I could keep the truth hidden while I figured out who in my life actually cared about me rather than what I could provide. Growing up in Marietta, Georgia, I had always been Daddy's little girl. My earliest memories were of sitting on the tailgate of his pickup truck, watching him review blueprints while eating bologna sandwiches from a cooler. William Morrison was just starting Morrison Construction then, working out of our garage with 2 employees and dreams bigger than our small suburban neighborhood could contain. My mother, Sarah, had died in a car accident when I was 8 years old. The drunk driver who hit her walked away without a scratch while she was pronounced dead at the scene. For 4 years, it was just Dad and me against the world. He would pick me up from school in his work truck, still covered in sawdust and concrete dust, and we would drive to job sites together. While other kids went to after-school activities, I learned to read measuring tapes and understand the difference between load-bearing walls and decorative partitions. Elena, Dad would say, lifting me onto stacks of lumber so I could see the construction progress. Building something that lasts isn't about having the fanciest tools or the biggest crew. It's about understanding every single detail and never cutting corners, even when nobody's watching. Those were the golden years, when I felt like his partner in everything. He would explain contracts to me over dinner, ask my opinion on color schemes for office buildings, and let me help him calculate material costs on his ancient calculator that printed numbers on long strips of paper. By the time I turned 12, I could estimate square footage in my head and knew the names of every subcontractor Dad worked with regularly. Everything changed when Dad met Vivian Blackwell at a charity fundraiser in downtown Atlanta. She was a recently divorced socialite who had received a substantial settlement from her first marriage and moved in circles that Dad had never experienced. Where my mother had been warm and practical, wearing jeans and helping Dad organize his paperwork, Vivian was polished and sophisticated, with perfect hair and an extensive wardrobe that cost more than most people's cars. The attraction was immediate and powerful. Dad, who had spent 4 years focused entirely on work and raising me, was swept off his feet by this elegant woman who seemed to represent everything his blue-collar background had never provided. Within 6 months they were engaged. Within a year they were married, and Vivian's 14-year-old daughter Madison moved into our house along with enough furniture and decorations to completely transform our modest home. Madison Blackwell was everything I wasn't: blonde where I was brunette, delicate where I was sturdy from years of construction sites, artistically inclined where I was mathematically minded. She spoke softly and moved gracefully, wore designer clothes even to casual family dinners, and had never worked a day in her life. While I could operate a drill and understood the basics of electrical wiring, Madison painted watercolors and played piano. The contrast wasn't lost on Dad, who seemed genuinely charmed by Madison's refinement. Suddenly, our dinner conversations shifted from construction projects to Madison's art classes and piano recitals. Our weekend job site visits became less frequent as Dad began attending cultural events that Vivian deemed important for expanding our horizons. Kyle was born 2 years later, when I was 14 and Madison was 16. Dad was over the moon about having a son, someone to carry on the Morrison name, and eventually take over the family business. I watched him hold Kyle with a tenderness I remembered from my early childhood, making promises about teaching him everything about construction and building an empire together. But even as a baby, Kyle was Vivian's project. She hired nannies and enrolled him in elite preschools, ensuring that he would grow up with the social advantages she felt Dad and I lacked. By the time Kyle could walk, he was attending private schools and summer camps that cost more than Dad's original annual salary. The divide in our household became increasingly clear as the years passed. Vivian and Madison lived in a world of country club memberships, charitable committees, and social events. Kyle was groomed to be the perfect combination of Morrison work ethic and Blackwell social status, and I found myself caught in the middle, too rough around the edges for Vivian's refined world, but increasingly isolated from the father who had once been my closest companion. High school was when the differences became impossible to ignore. Madison attended Westminster Academy, a prestigious private school known for its arts programs and connections to top universities. Kyle, even as a young child, was already enrolled in the preparatory programs that would lead him there as well. I attended the local public high school, not because Dad couldn't afford private school, but because Vivian argued that I would be more comfortable in a less demanding academic environment. The truth was more complicated. I had asked to stay in public school because my friends were there, and because I was already working part-time for Morrison Construction, learning the business from the ground up in ways that no prep school could teach. But Vivian's relief at not having to integrate me into Madison's social circle was obvious. While Madison took writing lessons and art classes, I spent my afternoons at construction sites, learning to operate heavy machinery and understanding the complexities of project management. While she attended debutante balls and charity galas, I was reviewing contracts and developing relationships with suppliers. But somehow, in the family hierarchy, my practical education was seen as less valuable than Madison's cultural refinement. The financial disparities were subtle but constant. Madison's art supplies came from expensive specialty stores in Buckhead. My work boots came from the discount outlet near the highway. Madison's bedroom was redecorated twice during high school to reflect her evolving aesthetic sensibilities. My room remained essentially unchanged from childhood, furnished with practical pieces that prioritized function over style. College preparations revealed the full extent of the inequity. Madison applied to prestigious art schools with tuition costs exceeding $60,000 per year. Her applications were professionally edited. Her portfolio was assembled with help from hired consultants, and her interviews were preceded by coaching sessions with specialists who charged hundreds of dollars per hour. When I expressed interest in studying civil engineering at Georgia Tech, Dad was supportive, but practical. "It's a good in-state school," he said, "and you can live at home to save money. Plus, you can keep working for the company part-time." There was no talk of consultants or coaching. I filled out my own applications, wrote my own essays, and prepared for interviews by myself. Madison was accepted to the Savannah College of Art and Design, one of the most expensive art schools in the country. The family celebrated with dinner at an upscale restaurant in downtown Atlanta, where Vivian toasted Madison's bright future in the arts. When I was accepted to Georgia Tech with a partial academic scholarship, the acknowledgement was brief and practical. "That's great, honey," Dad said. "It'll be nice having you close to home in the business." The pattern extended to every aspect of our lives. Madison's college wardrobe was purchased during shopping trips to high-end stores, complete with matching accessories and shoes for every outfit. My college clothes came from department store sales, and practical choices focused on durability rather than fashion. Madison's dorm room was furnished with coordinated pieces and decorated with original artwork. I commuted from home to save money on housing costs. But the most painful difference was in Dad's attention and expectations. Madison's academic struggles were met with understanding and additional support. When she changed her major 3 times, it was characterized as exploring her passions. When her grades suffered, tutors were hired and accommodations were made. She was encouraged to find herself and take time to discover her true calling. Meanwhile, I was expected to excel without additional support because, as Vivian frequently reminded everyone, I was naturally responsible and independent. My high grades were acknowledged but not celebrated. My growing expertise in construction and project management was appreciated but taken for granted. I was the reliable daughter who could be counted on to handle challenges without complaint or additional resources. The business became my refuge and my source of identity. While Madison struggled through her artistic explorations and Kyle grew up in the privileged bubble Vivian had created, I immersed myself in learning every aspect of Morrison construction. I spent summers working on site, learning from experienced foremen and developing practical skills that no classroom could provide. I studied business management in the evenings, reading industry publications and attending professional development seminars. Dad began to rely on me more heavily as the company grew. When he bid on larger projects, I helped with cost estimates and timeline projections. When problems arose on job sites, I was often the one who developed solutions and coordinated with subcontractors. By the time I graduated from college, I was functioning as an unofficial project manager, handling responsibilities that required both technical knowledge and business acumen. But even as my contributions to the company increased, the family dynamic remained unchanged. At family gatherings, Madison's latest artistic endeavors were discussed at length, while my professional achievements received brief acknowledgement before the conversation moved on. Kyle's childhood milestones were celebrated enthusiastically, while my adult accomplishments were expected rather than praised. Looking back, I can see how this dynamic shaped all of our expectations. Madison learned that she was inherently valuable and deserving of support regardless of her performance. Kyle learned that he was destined for leadership and inheritance simply by virtue of being male and bearing the Morrison name. And I learned that my worth was tied to my usefulness, that love and approval had to be earned through constant achievement and self-sufficiency. None of us realized that Dad was watching these dynamics play out with growing concern, or that he was quietly planning a way to ensure that merit, rather than favoritism, would ultimately determine who inherited the fruits of his life's work. After college, I officially joined Morrison Construction as a project coordinator, though I had been functioning in that capacity unofficially for years. The salary Dad offered was fair, but modest, especially considering my contributions to the company's growth. I accepted it without negotiation, grateful to be formally recognized as part of the team I had helped build. What I didn't realize was that this would mark the beginning of a systematic pattern, where my value to the family became increasingly tied to my financial contributions rather than my personal relationships with them. The first major incident occurred when Madison was in her junior year at SCAD. She had been struggling academically, changing majors from painting to sculpture to graphic design, extending her graduation timeline and increasing costs significantly. During a family dinner, Vivian casually mentioned that they were having trouble covering Madison's tuition for the upcoming semester. The art program costs have increased again, Vivian explained, delicately, cutting her salmon. And Madison's advisor recommended she take additional summer courses to catch up on credits. We're looking at an extra $15,000 beyond what we budgeted. Dad frowned, reviewing mental calculations. Business was good, but the company was also expanding, requiring significant reinvestment in equipment and personnel. That's a substantial amount on short notice, he said carefully. I watched Madison's face crumple with disappointment, and something in me couldn't bear to see her dreams derailed by financial constraints. I could help, I offered impulsively. I've been saving for a down payment on my own place, but Madison's education is more important. The relief on everyone's faces was immediate and profound. Dad looked grateful, Vivian appeared pleased, and Madison actually hugged me, tears in her eyes. Lena, you're the best sister ever, she whispered. I promise I'll pay you back someday. That $15,000 was my entire savings account, money I had accumulated through careful budgeting and overtime work. But seeing the family's appreciation, feeling like I had solved a crisis and proven my value, made the sacrifice seem worthwhile. I told myself it was an investment in family harmony and Madison's future. Madison never mentioned paying me back again. And within 6 months, she was posting pictures on social media from expensive restaurants and weekend trips to Charleston that clearly cost more than most people's monthly rent. When I gently asked about the repayment timeline, she looked confused and slightly hurt. I thought that was a gift, she said, her voice taking on the wounded tone she had perfected as a child. I mean, you offered it so freely. If you needed it back, why didn't you say it was a loan? The conversation made me feel petty and small, like I was being greedy for expecting repayment of money I had given to help my family. I dropped the subject, filing it away as a lesson learned about being more explicit about financial arrangements. But the precedent had been set. I was now the family member with discretionary income and a proven willingness to help during financial emergencies. What followed was a series of increasingly frequent and substantial requests that tested the boundaries of family obligation. Kyle's private school expenses became a recurring issue as he progressed through his teenage years. Westminster Academy wasn't just expensive for tuition, it came with additional costs for equipment, travel, and social activities that kept pace with the other wealthy families. When Kyle wanted to join the lacrosse team, the equipment alone cost $800. When his class took educational trips to Europe, the cost was $3,000 per student. Each time, the request came with emotional manipulation wrapped in family loyalty. Kyle is finally finding his passion, Vivian would explain. It would be devastating to hold him back for financial reasons when he's making such progress socially and academically. Dad would look stressed, caught between wanting to provide for his son and managing the practical constraints of business cash flow. And I would step in, unable to bear seeing Kyle disappointed or Dad overwhelmed by financial pressure. 500 here, 1,200 there, sometimes larger amounts for special opportunities that were presented as once-in-a-lifetime chances. Madison's needs evolved from tuition assistance to lifestyle support. After graduation, she moved to a trendy apartment in Virginia Highland, claiming she needed to be in the heart of Atlanta's arts community to network and find opportunities. The rent was $2,400 monthly, more than my own housing costs, but she argued it was an investment in her career development. When she couldn't find gallery representation or steady income from her artwork, the monthly shortfalls became my responsibility by default. Just until I get established, she would say, her eyes filling with tears whenever I hesitated. You know how hard it is for artists starting out. I just need a little more time to build my reputation. The monthly supplements started at $600 to help with rent, then expanded to include utilities, car payments, and insurance, when her part-time job at an upscale boutique didn't provide enough hours. Before I realized what had happened, I was essentially subsidizing Madison's entire lifestyle while she pursued her artistic dreams without any accountability for results or timeline. The most substantial financial drain came when Kyle graduated from Westminster and decided he wanted to attend Vanderbilt University instead of a more affordable in-state option. The tuition difference was staggering, nearly $40,000 more per year than he would have paid at the University of Georgia or Georgia Tech. Kyle has such potential, Vivian argued during a family meeting where the costs were laid out. Vanderbilt will provide connections and opportunities that he simply can't get at a state school. It's an investment in his future earning capacity. Dad looked exhausted by the financial pressure. The company was doing well, but college costs had escalated far beyond what he had planned for when Kyle was born. "I can cover about half," he said reluctantly, "but we'd need to take out significant loans for the rest, and that would impact the company's expansion plans." The silence stretched uncomfortably until Kyle himself spoke up. "Maybe Elena could help," he suggested with the casual entitlement that had characterized his entire upbringing. "She's always talking about how important education is, and she doesn't have kids or a mortgage to worry about." The assumption that my money was available for family use had become so normalized that Kyle didn't even frame it as a request. It was simply an expectation that I would contribute to his education because I had the means and fewer personal obligations. I found myself agreeing to cover $15,000 per year for Kyle's college expenses, telling myself it was an investment in his future and a way to help Dad avoid business debt. But unlike my assistance to Madison, which had started with specific needs and definite timelines, this commitment stretched ahead for 4 years with no clear endpoint. What made the pattern even more frustrating was how my contributions were acknowledged and appreciated. There were no family celebrations of my generosity, no expressions of genuine gratitude that made me feel valued for my sacrifices. Instead, my financial support was received with the same casual expectation that characterized Kyle's attitude toward Vivian's daily care or Madison's assumption that her artistic pursuits deserved family funding. The business side of Morrison Construction was thriving under my increasing involvement, but the family dynamics were becoming more extractive with each passing year. I was working 60-hour weeks, managing major projects worth millions of dollars, and using my salary and bonuses to subsidize everyone else's lifestyle choices while deferring my own goals and dreams. The final escalation came when Vivian decided she wanted to renovate the kitchen and master bathroom in the family home. The project she had in mind wasn't a simple update. It was a complete luxury renovation, featuring custom cabinetry, imported marble countertops, and high-end appliances that would rival those found in magazine spreads. "I've been living with that outdated kitchen for 15 years, she explained to Dad over dinner, producing a folder full of design inspirations and contractor estimates. "It's time we created a space that reflects the success of Morrison Construction and provides a proper setting for entertaining business associates." The renovation estimate was $65,000, a significant expense that would strain the family's personal finances even as the business continued to grow. Dad studied the proposals with the same attention he gave to commercial construction bids, clearly wrestling with the cost versus the potential benefits for business entertainment. "It would be nice to have a space where we could host clients more comfortably," he admitted, though his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. Vivian seized on his hesitation as an opening. "Elena could probably help with some of the costs," she suggested with the casual confidence of someone who had grown accustomed to my financial availability. "After all, she'll benefit from having a beautiful family home for holidays and gatherings." The logic was so circular it was almost impressive. I would pay for renovations to a house I didn't own, which would primarily benefit the people who lived there, so that I could enjoy visiting a more luxurious space during occasional family events. But by this point, saying no felt impossible without triggering accusations of selfishness or family disloyalty. I contributed $25,000 toward the renovation, money that came from my personal savings and a small business loan I took out privately. The kitchen was beautiful when completed, featured in a local home design magazine as an example of elegant Southern luxury. But every time I visited and saw the space I had helped create, I felt like a tenant in my own family home, someone whose financial contributions were valued more than her emotional presence. By the time Dad started showing signs of the illness that would eventually take his life, I had contributed well over $100,000 to various family needs and wants. Madison's lifestyle, Kyle's education, household improvements, emergency expenses, and countless smaller requests had created a pattern where my income was treated as a shared family resource, while everyone else's financial independence was carefully protected. What I didn't understand was that Dad had been watching this dynamic with growing concern, recognizing that his wife and children were exploiting my generosity while taking my contributions for granted. He was quietly developing a plan to ensure that my years of sacrifice would ultimately be recognized and compensated, even if it meant allowing the exploitation to continue until he could reveal the truth about who actually owned what I had been helping to build and maintain. The call that changed everything came on a rainy Tuesday morning in March. I was reviewing blueprints for the new Emory University Medical Facility project when my phone rang with an unknown number. Attorney Patricia Caldwell's voice was professionally gentle as she explained that my father had passed away peacefully in his sleep the previous night. Heart failure, she said, quick and painless, according to the medical examiner. Dad had been managing his cardiac condition for 2 years, but none of us had realized how serious it had become. He had hidden the severity of his illness with the same quiet determination he had shown throughout his life, not wanting to burden anyone with worry or change how we treated him during his final months. The funeral arrangements blurred together in a haze of grief and logistics. Vivian took charge of the planning with her usual attention to social appearances, selecting an expensive casket and elaborate flower arrangements that transformed the service into something resembling a society event, rather than a celebration of Dad's life. Madison flew in from an art residency program in Asheville that I had been funding, while Kyle drove down from Nashville where he was finishing his senior year. During the viewing, I stood beside the casket looking at Dad's peaceful face, trying to reconcile the man who had taught me everything about construction and business with the father who had apparently decided I deserved nothing from our shared life's work. His hands, which had shown me how to read blueprints and operate machinery, were folded quietly over his chest, holding secrets I was only beginning to discover. The days following the funeral were filled with the practical business of death. There were insurance forms to complete, business operations to maintain, and family members to comfort while managing my own grief. I threw myself into keeping Morrison Construction running smoothly, assuming that continuity of operations would be what Dad would have wanted most. Kyle returned to Vanderbilt after a week, eager to finish his final semester and graduate. Madison extended her stay, claiming she needed time to process her grief, though her processing seemed to involve expensive spa treatments and shopping trips that appeared on my credit card statements. Vivian oscillated between dramatic mourning and excited planning for her future as a wealthy widow. None of us talked directly about the will or inheritance during those first weeks. There seemed to be an unspoken agreement that such discussions would be inappropriate while we were still grieving. But I caught subtle conversations between Vivian and Madison about redecorating plans and travel ideas that suggested they were already counting money they assumed would soon be theirs. The call from Attorney Caldwell requesting a family meeting came exactly 4 weeks after Dad's death. Her tone was neutral but official as she explained that we needed to gather for the formal reading of the will and discussion of estate distribution. She suggested we meet at her downtown Atlanta office the following Friday at 2 o'clock. During the drive to the law office, I found myself filled with conflicting emotions. Part of me hoped that Dad had recognized my contributions to the company and provided some acknowledgement of my role in building Morrison Construction, but a larger part of me had already accepted that Kyle, as the male heir, would inherit the business regardless of who had actually done the work to make it successful. The conference room where we gathered felt formal and intimidating, with its polished mahogany table and wall-mounted diplomas that testified to Caldwell's legal credentials. Vivian arrived dressed in designer black, her grief carefully accessorized with expensive jewelry and perfect makeup. Madison wore a flowing dress that managed to be both mourning-appropriate and Instagram-worthy. Kyle looked uncomfortable in a suit he had clearly borrowed, fidgeting with nervous energy. As Caldwell began reading the will, each bequest felt like a small knife wound. The house I had helped maintain and improve going to Vivian, the investment portfolio I had helped build through my family contributions, going to Madison. The business I had literally helped construct from the ground up, going to Kyle, who had never shown genuine interest in the daily operations or long-term strategy. When my own inheritance was announced, vintage construction equipment, and Dad's personal library, the room fell silent, except for the ticking of that antique clock. I felt simultaneously numb and devastated, trying to process how 29 years of being the reliable daughter had resulted in receiving what amounted to garage sale leftovers. But it was the casual way my family received the news that truly broke my heart. There was no surprise, no expressions of sympathy for my disappointment, no acknowledgement that the distribution might seem unfair given my contributions. Instead, there was an almost palpable sense of relief, as if they had been worried that I might receive something more substantial that would reduce their own inheritances. Vivian's comment about my capability and independence felt like the final insult. A dismissal wrapped in false praise that revealed how completely my value had been reduced to my ability to solve problems and provide financial support. The assumption that I would simply accept this outcome with grace, because that's what Elena always did, made me feel invisible as a person while being valued only as a resource. The immediate aftermath of the will reading was a blur of conflicting emotions. Kyle's obvious excitement about inheriting the company despite having no real qualifications to run it felt like watching someone receive an award for a marathon they had never trained for. Madison's whispered planning with Vivian about redecorating and investment strategies made it clear that they viewed Dad's death primarily as a financial opportunity rather than a personal loss. As we prepared to leave the conference room, I felt like I was watching my life from outside my body. The family I had sacrificed for, supported financially, and prioritized above my own needs had just demonstrated exactly how little my contributions meant to them. I wasn't a daughter or sister in their eyes. I was a convenient ATM who had finally reached the end of her usefulness. But then Caldwell asked me to stay behind for additional discussion, and something in her tone suggested that this devastating meeting was not the complete story. The way she had avoided my eyes during certain parts of the reading, the slight emphasis she had placed on certain words, the professional mask that seemed to be hiding something more complex, all of it indicated that there were layers to this situation that hadn't yet been revealed. After my family left, chattering excitedly about their new financial circumstances, the conference room felt different. The oppressive weight of disappointment was still there, but it was mixed with curiosity and a strange sense of anticipation. Caldwell's demeanor shifted subtly as she moved to close the door, transforming from a neutral legal professional to someone who clearly had more information to share. When she returned to the table with a different folder, marked with red tabs and significantly thicker than the documents we had just reviewed, my heart began racing with possibilities I couldn't yet imagine. The revelation that Dad had been systematically transferring ownership of real assets to me over the past 8 years hit me like a physical blow, reorganizing everything I thought I knew about my relationship with him and my position in the family. The documents spread across the table told a story I hadn't known I was living: property deeds, corporate filings, bank account statements, and ownership certificates that revealed a parallel legal reality where I was not the forgotten daughter, but the primary beneficiary of Dad's actual wealth. The Morrison construction that Kyle had inherited was essentially a corporate shell, while the real assets, the properties, the major contracts, the equipment leases, the intellectual property, belonged to holding companies that I owned completely. Looking at my signature on documents I remembered signing as routine business paperwork, I realized that Dad had been conducting an elaborate test of my family's character, while simultaneously ensuring that merit rather than favoritism would determine who controlled his life's work. Every time I had signed off on a major project or approved a corporate restructuring, I had been unknowingly accepting ownership of pieces of an inheritance that dwarfed what my family thought they had received. The genius and cruelty of his plan was breathtaking. He had allowed my family to reveal their true priorities and values by giving them exactly what they thought they wanted, while ensuring that the daughter who had actually built the business alongside him would ultimately control everything that mattered. Kyle could play at being a construction company owner with his inherited shell corporation, but the real power, the real assets, the real future of Dad's empire belonged to me. As the full scope of the revelation sank in, I realized that I was not the victim of my father's final betrayal, but the beneficiary of his ultimate act of justice. He had seen how my family exploited my generosity and took my contributions for granted, and he had developed a plan to ensure that their true character would be exposed while my years of sacrifice would be properly rewarded. The question now was what I would do with this knowledge, and how long I could keep the truth hidden while I figured out which relationships in my life were based on genuine care versus calculated self-interest. Walking out of Patricia Caldwell's office that Friday afternoon, I felt like I was carrying a nuclear secret. The weight of the knowledge was almost physical. Every document in the thick folder she had given me represented a piece of the puzzle that completely inverted my family's understanding of our financial reality. I drove home in a daze, barely registering the Atlanta traffic as my mind raced through the implications of what I had learned. My first instinct was to call Kyle immediately and explain that his inheritance was essentially worthless. Then I wanted to text Madison and let her know that her investment portfolio was a fraction of what she thought. Part of me even considered driving straight to Vivian's house and revealing that the woman who had just inherited a multi-million-dollar home was actually living in a house owned by holding companies that belonged to me. But Caldwell's advice echoed in my mind. Your father specifically requested that you take time to observe how your family behaves when they believe they have everything, and you have nothing. He wanted you to see their true character before deciding how to proceed. So, instead of making those calls, I went home to my modest apartment and spread the documents across my dining room table, trying to fully comprehend the scope of what Dad had orchestrated. The holding companies alone were worth more than $12 million. The real estate portfolio included not just the properties Morrison Construction operated from, but also several commercial buildings in prime Atlanta locations that generated substantial rental income. The intellectual property rights to construction innovations Dad had developed over the years were worth hundreds of thousands annually in licensing fees. Kyle's inherited Morrison Construction was essentially a front company with the rights to use the name, some basic equipment, and enough operating capital to keep him busy for a couple of years if he managed it carefully. But all the valuable contracts, the relationships with major clients, the proprietary systems Dad had developed, everything that gave the company real worth, belonged to me through various corporate structures I was only now beginning to understand. The temptation to reveal the truth immediately was overwhelming, but I forced myself to wait and watch. Dad had gone to extraordinary lengths to create this test, and I owed it to his memory to let it play out as he had intended. The first indication of how my family truly viewed our relationship came that very evening. Kyle called me around 9 o'clock, his voice filled with an excitement that made me feel slightly sick. "Elena, can you believe it? I own Morrison Construction." His enthusiasm was genuine but painfully naive. "I've been thinking about all the changes I want to make. Maybe we could expand into residential development, or start a luxury home division. The possibilities are endless." I bit my tongue as he outlined plans that demonstrated his complete lack of understanding about the construction industry, cash flow management, or the existing client relationships that kept the company profitable. "That sounds exciting, Kyle," I managed to say. "Have you thought about the transition period?" Dad was very involved in the day-to-day operations. "Oh, I figure I'll learn as I go," he said with the casual confidence of someone who had never had to face serious consequences for his mistakes. "Besides, you know all the operational stuff, right? You can help me get up to speed while I focus on the big picture strategy." The assumption that I would continue working for the company under his leadership, helping him succeed with an inheritance I had actually earned, was breathtaking in its entitlement. "We should probably discuss the details once you graduate," I said carefully. "Definitely. Oh, and Elena? I know you're probably disappointed about not getting more from Dad's will, but don't worry, I'll make sure you're taken care of. Maybe a small ownership stake or a management bonus program. Family has to stick together, right?" The condescension in his voice, the casual promise to throw me scraps from an inheritance that was legally mine, made me grip the phone so tightly my knuckles went white. "That's very thoughtful of you, Kyle. Madison's call came the next morning, her tone distinctly different from Kyle's excitement. "Alina, I've been thinking about our conversation with the lawyer," she began, and I could hear the calculated concern in her voice. "Are you okay? I mean really okay, because if you need help, you know we're here for you." "I appreciate that, Madison. I'm managing fine. It's just that I know you were probably expecting more from Dad's estate. And honestly, I feel a little guilty about getting so much when you got so little." She paused, letting the guilt trip settle before continuing. "I was thinking, maybe I could help you out a little. You know, share some of my inheritance to make things more fair." The offer sounded generous on the surface, but I recognized the manipulation beneath it. Madison was establishing herself as the benevolent sister who was willing to sacrifice for family, setting up a dynamic where I would be grateful for any assistance and therefore less likely to challenge the overall distribution. "What did you have in mind?" I asked, curious to see how far her supposed generosity would extend. "Well, I was thinking maybe I could give you a small amount monthly. Like $500? Just to help with your expenses while you figure out your next steps." $500 from an inheritance worth nearly $2 million. The math was insulting, but the tone was even worse, like she was offering charity to a struggling relative rather than acknowledging that the entire situation was unfair. "That's a kind offer, Madison, but I don't think it's necessary." "Are you sure? Because I really want to help. It's not right that Dad left you with so little when you worked so hard for the company." The false sympathy was thick in her voice, and I realized she was already rehearsing this narrative for extended family members who might question the distribution. Vivian's approach was the most sophisticated of all. She invited me to lunch at the country club 2 days after the will reading, choosing a setting that reinforced her new status as a wealthy widow, while positioning our conversation as a generous gesture from her elevated position. "Alina, darling," she began over expensive salads that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week. "I've been worried about you since Friday. You seemed so shocked by your father's will, and I want to make sure you understand that it wasn't personal." "What do you mean?" "Well, your father always said you were the strongest of his children, the most capable, the most independent. He knew you would be fine no matter what happened. While Kyle and Madison needed more security and structure." She leaned forward conspiratorially. "Between you and me, I think he was worried about Kyle's ability to handle responsibility. This inheritance might be exactly what he needs to mature and develop some business sense." The revisionist history was stunning. Kyle's lack of responsibility was now being framed as the reason he deserved the inheritance, while my competence was being used to justify why I had received nothing. It was psychological manipulation of the highest order, designed to make me feel noble about being cheated while accepting that my siblings' weaknesses made them more deserving of support. "Of course," Vivian continued, "I hope you know that you'll always be welcome in our family home, and if you ever need anything, really anything, you just have to ask. We're family after all." The offer was positioned as generosity, but it was actually a power play. She was establishing that I would be a guest in a house I had helped maintain and improve, dependent on her goodwill for access to my own family. The underlying message was clear: accept your reduced status gracefully, and we'll allow you to remain connected to the family on our terms. That evening, I sat in my apartment reviewing the hidden ownership documents again, trying to process the emotional whiplash of these conversations. In less than a week, I had gone from being the responsible daughter who was taken for granted to being the pitied sister who needed charity from her more fortunate siblings. But the most revealing aspect of their behavior wasn't the condescension or the manipulation, it was the complete absence of genuine concern for my emotional well-being. None of them had asked how I was processing Dad's death or whether I needed support during my grief. None of them had acknowledged that the will distribution might feel like a final rejection from the father I had worked so hard to please. Instead, they had immediately moved into damage control mode, each trying to position themselves as generous benefactors while ensuring that I remained grateful and compliant. The family dynamic I had experienced my entire life, where my value was tied to my usefulness rather than my inherent worth, was being replicated in this new reality, where I was expected to appreciate whatever scraps they were willing to share. By the end of that first week, I had made a decision. I would continue to let them believe their version of reality, while I consulted with financial advisors and attorneys to understand the full scope of my actual inheritance. Dad had given me a gift that went beyond money. He had shown me exactly how my family viewed our relationships when they thought they held all the power. The question now was not whether I would reveal the truth, but when and how I would use this knowledge to reclaim not just my inheritance, but my dignity and self-respect. For the first time in my adult life, I had the power to set the terms of my family relationships, rather than simply accepting whatever treatment they chose to give me. The game had changed completely, even if they didn't know it yet. The following weeks revealed a side of my family I had never fully recognized, despite years of subtle manipulation and financial exploitation. Now that they believed they held all the cards, their true personalities emerged with startling clarity, unfiltered by the need to maintain my goodwill or financial support. Kyle graduated from Vanderbilt in May and returned to Atlanta with grand plans for transforming Morrison Construction. His first move was to schedule a meeting with the company's senior staff. Positioning himself as the visionary new leader who would modernize operations and expand into exciting new markets, I attended as the outgoing project manager, curious to see how he would handle his first real business challenge. The meeting was a disaster from start to finish. Kyle arrived 20 minutes late, wearing an expensive suit that Vivian had clearly purchased for the occasion, and launched into a presentation about his vision for the company that demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the construction industry. He proposed pivoting to luxury residential development without understanding zoning regulations, suggested implementing new technologies that didn't exist yet, and outlined expansion plans that would require capital investments far beyond what the inherited company could support. Our longtime foreman, Miguel Santos, who had worked with Dad for 15 years, asked pointed questions about timeline and budgets that Kyle couldn't answer. Sarah Chen, our lead architect, inquired about the regulatory approvals required for his proposed changes, and Kyle deflected with vague promises to look into those details later. When the head of our accounting department, Robert Kim, presented the actual financial constraints facing the company, Kyle dismissed the numbers as too conservative and suggested they were underestimating his ability to attract new investors. After the meeting, several employees approached me privately to express their concerns. "Alina, what's really going on here?" Miguel asked, his weathered face creased with worry. "Your father spent decades building this company's reputation, and Kyle seems ready to throw it all away with these crazy ideas." I found myself in an impossible position. I couldn't reveal the truth about the hidden ownership structure without Dad's explicit permission, which would have to come through Caldwell according to the legal documents. But I also couldn't watch employees who had been loyal to Dad for years worry about their job security under Kyle's incompetent leadership. "Give it some time," I advised carefully. "Things have a way of working themselves out." Kyle's second week as the ostensible owner of Morrison Construction brought even more concerning developments. He hired an expensive business consultant without consulting anyone, spending $15,000 for a strategic analysis that recommended exactly the same unrealistic expansion plans Kyle had already proposed. He also started negotiating with a luxury car dealership to lease a BMW for client meetings, despite the fact that Dad had always driven practical pickup trucks that demonstrated his connection to the actual work. More troubling was Kyle's treatment of long-term employees. When Miguel suggested that some of Kyle's proposed changes might not be practical, given industry standards, Kyle responded by questioning Miguel's commitment to innovation and suggesting that perhaps the company needed fresh perspectives in leadership positions. The threat was subtle but clear: support my vision unconditionally, or find somewhere else to work. Madison's behavior during this period was equally revealing, though in different ways. Her investment portfolio, which she had assumed was worth nearly $2 million, turned out to be significantly more modest when she met with the financial advisor to begin accessing the funds. The account contained approximately $600,000, still substantial but far less than she had calculated during her initial excitement. Her reaction to this discovery was telling. Instead of accepting that she had misunderstood the initial valuation, she became convinced that someone had made an error, or that funds were being hidden from her. She called me repeatedly, demanding that I help her investigate what she was certain was a mistake in the estate accounting. "Elena, something's not right with my inheritance," she said during one particularly frantic phone call. "The numbers don't match what Caldwell told us at the reading. I think someone's been stealing from Dad's accounts. Have you spoken to the financial advisor about your concerns? He keeps giving me these complicated explanations about market fluctuations and administrative fees, but I know something's wrong. You understand business better than I do. Can't you look into it for me?" The irony was painful. Madison wanted my help investigating financial irregularities that didn't exist, while remaining completely oblivious to the actual financial structure that had been hidden from all of them. But her request also revealed that even now, with her own substantial inheritance, she still expected me to solve her problems and provide expertise whenever she encountered difficulties. When I declined to get involved in her financial concerns, suggesting she work directly with her advisors, Madison's response shifted from desperate to accusatory. "I can't believe you won't help me with this," she said, her voice taking on the petulant tone I remembered from her teenage years. "After everything our family has done for you, you won't even help when I'm being cheated." Everything our family had done for me. The statement was so disconnected from reality that I almost laughed, but it revealed how completely Madison had internalized a version of our family history where she was the generous benefactor and I was the grateful recipient of their kindness. Vivian's post-inheritance behavior was the most calculated and therefore the most disturbing. Within 3 weeks of the will reading, she had hired an interior designer to completely redecorate the family home, spending lavishly on furniture and artwork that reflected her vision of how a wealthy widow should live. The renovations I had helped fund were dismissed as outdated, replaced with trendy pieces that cost more than most people's annual salaries. But her real focus was on establishing herself as a prominent figure in Atlanta's social scene. She joined exclusive clubs, began hosting charity fundraisers, and made large donations to cultural organizations that would ensure her name appeared in society pages. The money Dad had saved through decades of careful business management was being spent on social positioning and lifestyle inflation that served no purpose beyond Vivian's ego. When I visited the house to collect some of Dad's personal items that had been left to me, I barely recognized the space where I had grown up. The workshop where Dad and I had reviewed blueprints had been converted into a wine cellar. The modest den where we had watched football games together was now a formal sitting room with white furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than a family home. "Isn't it gorgeous?" Vivian asked, giving me a tour like I was a visitor rather than someone who had lived there for years. "The designer says the aesthetic reflects understated elegance with contemporary sophistication. It's exactly what this house needed to reach its potential." The casual dismissal of Dad's memory, the erasure of the spaces where we had built our relationship, felt like a deliberate insult, but Vivian seemed genuinely oblivious to the emotional impact of her choices, focused entirely on creating an environment that supported her new identity as a woman of means. During this period, I began meeting regularly with financial advisors and attorneys to understand the full scope of my hidden inheritance. The meetings were conducted with absolute confidentiality, and I used a different law firm to avoid any potential conflicts with Caldwell's representation of the estate. What I learned was staggering in its complexity and foresight. Dad had spent nearly a decade creating the legal structure that would eventually transfer real ownership to me, while maintaining the appearance that Kyle was inheriting the family business. The holding companies, property trusts, and corporate arrangements were so sophisticated that it would have taken a team of forensic accountants months to unravel the true ownership structure, even if someone had known to look for it. But beyond the financial engineering, the emotional intelligence behind Dad's plan became increasingly clear. He had recognized that my family's treatment of me was fundamentally exploitative, but he had also understood that simply telling me this wouldn't have been enough to help me see it clearly. By creating circumstances where they revealed their true priorities and values, he had given me undeniable evidence of how little they actually valued me as a person, rather than as a resource. The validation was both liberating and heartbreaking. For years, I had wondered if I was being too sensitive about family dynamics, if my perception of unfairness was colored by my own insecurities or unrealistic expectations. Dad's elaborate plan confirmed that my instincts had been correct. I was being taken advantage of by people who cared more about what I could provide than who I was as a human being. As summer progressed, I watched Kyle struggle with increasingly obvious problems at Morrison Construction while Madison burned through her inheritance at an alarming rate, and Vivian continued her expensive social climbing. None of them asked how I was adjusting to my reduced circumstances, or whether I needed emotional support during what should have been a difficult transition period. Instead, they seemed to assume that I would simply fade into the background, grateful for whatever minimal contact they chose to maintain while they enjoyed their new wealth. The daughter who had sacrificed for years to support their dreams and lifestyle was expected to disappear quietly now that she was no longer useful, but I was no longer the same person who had accepted their treatment without question. Dad's final gift wasn't just the hidden inheritance. It was the clarity to see my family's true nature and the power to choose how I wanted to respond to that knowledge. For the first time in my adult life, I held all the cards and I was beginning to understand how I wanted to play them. The moment I decided to reveal the truth came on a sweltering August afternoon when Kyle called me in a panic. Morrison Construction was facing its first major crisis under his leadership, and the consequences of his inexperience were about to become catastrophically public. "Elena, I need your help," he said, his voice tight with stress. "The Henderson Municipal Project is falling apart. The city inspector found code violations, and they're threatening to shut down the entire job site. If we can't fix this in the next 48 hours, we'll lose the contract and probably face lawsuits." The Henderson Municipal contract was worth $15 million over 3 years, exactly the kind of high-profile project that had built Morrison Construction's reputation under Dad's leadership. But Kyle had made unauthorized changes to the approved plans, trying to cut costs and increase profit margins, without understanding the regulatory requirements that governed public construction projects. "What kind of code violations?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "Something about electrical systems and fire safety protocols. The inspector is saying we didn't follow the specifications, but I know we did. This has to be some kind of mistake or political thing." Kyle's voice carried the same defensive tone he had used as a child, whenever his failures were exposed. The irony was perfect. Kyle was asking for help with a crisis of his own making, while unknowingly speaking to the person who actually owned the contracts, relationships, and expertise that could solve his problem. But resolving this crisis would require revealing truths that would fundamentally alter every relationship in our family. "Kyle, I need to tell you something important. Can you meet me at Caldwell's office tomorrow morning?" "Caldwell's office? Why? This is about construction management, not legal stuff. Trust me on this. Bring Vivian and Madison. There are things about Dad's estate that you all need to understand." That evening, I called Patricia Caldwell and requested an emergency meeting. According to the legal documents Dad had left, I had the authority to reveal the true ownership structure at any time after the initial will reading, but the decision and timing were entirely mine. The crisis at Morrison Construction had forced my hand, but I realized I was ready to stop living in the shadows of my family's assumptions. The next morning, I arrived at Caldwell's office, 30 minutes early, carrying a folder containing financial statements, ownership documents, and a letter Dad had written specifically for this moment. My hands were steady as I reviewed the materials one final time, but my heart was racing with anticipation and anxiety about how this revelation would change everything. Kyle arrived first, looking harried and desperate. Madison came with him, complaining about having to reschedule a spa appointment for what she assumed was another tedious legal meeting. Vivian swept in 15 minutes late, dressed as if she were attending a social event rather than a business conference. "Elena, what's this about?" Vivian demanded, as soon as Caldwell closed the conference room door. "Kyle said there's some problem with the construction business, but I don't understand why that requires another family meeting." Caldwell took her position at the head of the table, her expression professionally neutral but with a hint of anticipation. Elena has requested this meeting to discuss additional aspects of your father's estate planning that weren't appropriate to reveal during the initial will reading. Additional aspects? Madison looked confused. What do you mean? We already know what Dad left to everyone. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. What you know is what Dad wanted you to know, initially. But there's more to the story. Much more. For the next 30 minutes, Caldwell and I systematically revealed the true structure of Dad's estate. We showed them the holding company documents that proved I owned the real Morrison construction assets. We explained the property trusts that made me the actual owner of the commercial real estate they thought Kyle had inherited. We demonstrated how the investment accounts they had been so excited about were dwarfed by assets that had been quietly transferred to my control over the past 8 years. The silence in the room was deafening. As the implications sank in, Kyle's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally a kind of deflated understanding. Madison stared at the documents like they were written in a foreign language, her mouth slightly open. Vivian's carefully composed facade cracked completely, revealing raw shock and calculation. "This is impossible," Kyle said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been running Morrison Construction for 3 months. I've been making decisions, spending money, and hiring people. You've been running a subsidiary company that bears the Morrison Construction name," I explained gently. "But the valuable contracts, the real client relationships, the intellectual property, and most of the equipment belong to holding companies that I control. The Henderson Municipal contract, that's currently in crisis. That contract was signed by Morrison Holdings LLC, which I own completely." Madison found her voice next, and it was sharp with accusation. "You knew this whole time? You let us think we had inherited everything while you were secretly the rich one." "I found out the same day you did, Madison. Dad structured this as a test. He wanted to see how you would all treat me when you thought you had everything, and I had nothing." The room erupted. Kyle accused me of manipulating the situation and stealing his rightful inheritance. Madison claimed I had been plotting against the family for years. Vivian demanded to know if the house she had been renovating actually belonged to her or was part of some elaborate deception. But their anger felt powerless now that the truth was exposed. They could rage and accuse, but they couldn't change the legal reality that Dad had spent years carefully constructing. I was not the forgotten daughter begging for scraps. I was the primary beneficiary who had been watching them reveal their true characters while believing they held all the power. "Why?" Vivian asked finally, her voice hollow. "Why would William do this to his own family?" I pulled out Dad's letter, the one Caldwell had given me months earlier but that I had been saving for this moment. In his familiar handwriting, Dad had explained his reasoning with the same careful logic he had applied to every major decision in his life. He wrote that he had watched for years as you all took my contributions for granted while expecting me to be endlessly grateful for minimal consideration in return. I read aloud. He said he had tried to address the imbalance subtly, but that direct confrontation would only have led to temporary changes and increased resentment. This way, he could ensure that merit rather than favoritism determined who controlled his life's work, while giving me undeniable evidence of how I was actually valued by the people I had sacrificed for. Kyle slumped in his chair, the weight of his situation finally registering. "So what happens now? Do I lose everything?" For the first time since the revelation began, I felt a pang of sympathy for him. Kyle was entitled and naive, but he was also my brother, and his failures were partly the result of how he had been raised to expect success without effort. "The Henderson municipal crisis can be resolved," I said carefully. "I have the expertise and relationships to fix the code violations and save the contract. But going forward, we need to restructure how Morrison Construction operates." Over the following hours, we negotiated a new arrangement that reflected the true ownership structure, while allowing Kyle to maintain some dignity and purpose. He would remain as a junior project manager, learning the business properly under my direct supervision. The inflated salary and executive privileges he had assumed were his birthright would be replaced with compensation appropriate to his actual skills and contributions. Madison's financial situation required different adjustments. Her investment portfolio, while smaller than she had initially believed, was still substantial enough to support a comfortable lifestyle if managed responsibly. That her pattern of excessive spending and financial dependence needed to change. I offered to help her develop a realistic budget and investment strategy, but only if she demonstrated genuine commitment to financial responsibility. Vivian's response was the most predictable. She immediately began calculating how to maintain her elevated lifestyle with reduced resources, exploring options for selling or refinancing assets she thought she owned. When she realized that even the family home was subject to restrictions through the trust structure Dad had created, her composure finally shattered completely. "This is vindictive and cruel," she said, tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face. "William is reaching from the grave to punish us for not treating Elena exactly the way he thought we should." But I no longer felt angry about Vivian's manipulation or hurt by her selfishness. Dad's plan had given me something more valuable than money. He had given me clarity about the difference between relationships based on genuine love and connections based on mutual benefit. Vivian had never loved me as a stepdaughter. She had simply tolerated me as long as I was useful. Now that the power dynamic had shifted, she felt victimized by the same kind of calculated treatment she had always given me. The months that followed were challenging but ultimately transformative for everyone involved. Kyle's pride was wounded, but he gradually began to develop genuine skills and appreciation for the construction industry. Working under my mentorship, he learned the basics of project management, regulatory compliance, and client relations that he should have absorbed years earlier. Madison struggled initially with her reduced financial circumstances, but she eventually found a job at a local art gallery and began creating work that reflected genuine passion rather than the superficial aesthetics that had characterized her previous efforts. The financial constraints forced her to develop practical skills and a work ethic she had never needed before. Vivian adapted by downsizing her lifestyle and eventually moving to a smaller but still comfortable home. She remained bitter about the loss of her elevated social status, but she also began volunteering for charitable organizations in ways that seemed motivated by genuine concern rather than social positioning. As for me, I finally felt free to build the life I had always deferred in service of family obligations. I expanded Morrison Construction's operations, implementing innovative sustainable building practices that positioned us as leaders in environmental construction. I bought a beautiful home in a historic Atlanta neighborhood, decorated it according to my own tastes rather than anyone else's expectations, and began dating a fellow engineer who appreciated both my professional accomplishments and my personal independence. The relationship with my family evolved into something more honest and balanced. We still gathered for holidays, but the dynamics were fundamentally different. Kyle treated me with genuine respect rather than condescending tolerance. Madison asked for advice instead of expecting automatic support. Even Vivian's interactions with me became more authentic, stripped of the false warmth that had masked her calculated manipulation. Dad's final gift wasn't just the financial inheritance. It was the knowledge that I deserved relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection. By showing me how my family behaved when they thought they held all the power, he had taught me to recognize and reject treatment that diminished my worth as a person. Sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable dysfunction, even when that refusal comes at great personal cost. Dad's elaborate plan had cost him the comfortable fiction that his family was united by genuine care, rather than financial convenience. But it has given me something invaluable: the confidence to demand better from the people in my life, and the resources to build relationships based on authentic connection, rather than obligation. I keep Dad's letter in my home office, next to pictures of us working together on construction sites. It reminds me daily that true legacy isn't about the money you leave behind. It's about the wisdom you pass on and the courage you inspire in the people you love most. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.